as I got from Professor Hisham, he had written feedback. So if you have written feedback, kindly provide us with that written feedback. If not, of course, the team at PSI will be jotting down the discussions. However, should you decide to provide us with your comment in writing, this would enable us to convey your idea clearly, of course. At the end of the publication, there is the book, just like proceedings, of course. Every chapter, you have the 3 papers with the commentary and the discussions. So, the... Stop. Yeah. If you're not taking the floor, kindly put yourselves on mute, and I'll be reminding you, Dr. Abraman says, the entire session will cover like 1.5 hours, and we have to stick to time, as we got it from Saleh, because this is one of the technical issues we have to adhere to, and we cannot overlook. Doctor, yes. Thank you, Dr. Heba, for muting. So we want everything to be succinct, precise, and also time is of essence. So we'll go live at 6. We'll go live at 6, exactly. Please, if you're not taking the floor, you need to mute yourself. Otherwise, you'll have an echo.
Hisham Jafar.
I believe it's Dr. Hisham Jafar. So please contact Hisham Jafar. Yes, I will. So is this you, Dr. Hisham? ASUS?
طيب احنا جاهزين بانتظار
Okay, we're ready. Kindly make sure that you mute yourselves. In 1 minute, we'll go live.
الحوار إن شاء الله.
Good afternoon,
Recording in progress.
everybody.
الإسلام السياسي بعد عقد من
You are welcome to this conference. You are welcome to this conference being held by PSI Policy and Society Institute, Political Islam 10 years after the Arab Spring, with the participation of Arab elites who are specialized in political Islam in many Arab countries. Today we will start the first session of this conference. Please allow me to welcome our great Dr. His Excellency Adnan Abu Ode from PSI to welcome the guests.
أستاذ عدنان تفضل المايك معك. أستاذ عدنان.
Saleh, do you hear the interpreter? Saleh? Hello, Dr. Muhammad. Hello, Tim. Ladies and gentlemen. I salute you, and I hope I wish this meeting all success. As a matter of fact, my age allows me to speak around some themes, including this theme that we will discuss today, which is the Islamic movements and power. Since 1950s, the Arab world has witnessed a number of transformations. The first one was the political, the military power, and left us some problems, and then left us with some pan-Arab transformation in 1967. And after war, we had the Islamic transformation. This led to new transformations, which will be discussed tonight. And it actually left its international impact, which is called the Islamic terrorism. It's one form of transformations. And Islamic terrorism reminds me of 1960s, 70s, when we have the anti-communist movement. And it's the West that talks a lot about Islamic extremism. During our youth, we used to hear about combating communism. And it's very important, and it's of importance to the youth. I address our guests. We, as a Policy and Society Institute, we are very much interested in the youth, and the youth is of great importance, especially after the fall of the former Soviet Union and Berlin Wall. After that, the world was done with the socialism and started talking about what we call the global values: justice, social justice, freedom, democracy, so on and so forth. So our Arab world is on this verge now, and the conference we're holding today and the Arab Spring was the beginning of all of this, and the results and the outcomes of the Arab Spring did not achieve what the demands were for, but it took a different format. So I believe that such a conference and its topic is of paramount importance. I personally would like to hear, because I would like to learn from the researchers about this, because this is the topic of the hour, not only in Jordan, but in the entire Arab world. Thank you so much, and you are welcome.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Adnan. Now I'll give the floor to Sholat. The floor is yours. He's addressing you in English.
In a new conference, new cooperation between the Institute and the Friedrich Ebert. The floor to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. رح يحكي باللغة الإنجليزية.
Yes.
ممكن تشغلوا الترجمة إذا because I will speak in English and I don't know if it works. You have to press a button.
الانتربريتيشن موجودة تحت كخيار اللي حاب يعرف أو يسمع بالعربي موجودة. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Dear Ustaz Adnan Abu Ode, dear Dr. Mohammed Abu Roman, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, FBS, to our discussion session today. It shall be the first in a series of 5 sessions, all of them jointly organized by the Politics and Society Institute, PIS and FES, and all of them under the general headline Political Islam 10 years after the Arab Spring, with very specialized notions each. About why FES engages in this topic, just a few words. As you know, for FES Amman, this topic has been and still is at the heart of our research endeavors. We are entrusted with funds of the German government to support democratic development in Jordan. As FES, we believe that true support cannot be given without a serious attempt at understanding society and how it is developing. Therefore, as part of our work, we finance and conduct research on political, cultural, and societal development. Since political Islam continues to play a significant role in the region and in Jordan, it remains a topic of our interest. About today, our first session today is about 3 countries where the Muslim Brotherhood, at least initially, profited from the changes that came with the Arab Spring. The Brotherhood gained influence in many countries after 2011, and it lost it again in some of them. The particular reasons for the seemingly tidal gain and loss of power in each country are worth a closer look. So I very much look forward to the case studies from Egypt, Tunisia, and Morocco that will be presented today. I even look forward much more to reading the studies once they have been published and edited by our friend Dr. Mohammed. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank His Excellency Adnan Abu Odeh, the chairman of PSI's Council of Trustees, for hosting this event and for the fruitful cooperation between our 2 institutions. Likewise, I am grateful to our friend Dr. Mohammed Abu Rahman for his many good ideas, academic spirit, political thought, and hard work that he invests in all of our joint projects. Dr. Mohammed will be our moderator today, and he has also agreed to serve as the editor of the publication we wish to produce together as a result of these 5 sessions. Thanks to the authors of today's papers for their rich contributions. And last but not least, I would like to thank Dr. Ja'far Hassan. He agreed to this cooperation together in this office, in this very office, when he was still serving as PSI's director. Now that he was called by His Majesty to return to his former position as chief of His Majesty's office, we wish him all the success and the best of luck for his important post. And without any further ado, I would stop talking now by wishing you and us helpful insights and a fruitful discussion. And thank you.
شكرا جزيلا تيم.
Thank you indeed, Tim. Thank you all for being here with us today. We'd like to welcome Si Salah Al-Jursi, who is working with the camera and the focus. He's trying to introduce some fun and he's on mute and he doesn't know it. Anyways, of course, that it's good that you're stopped the car so that we can start with the dialogue. Without further ado, I'm actually quite interested and enthusiastic about listening to this issue, to the topic, the issue of Islam. And today, the Islam and the Islamists and the power crisis, to say the least, for today, given the fact that power and authority involve challenges, as is the case with the opposition and its challenges, as emphasized in the 3 papers, as you will see later on. The papers, the text of the papers are there with you. Without further ado, however, the philosophy that after the Arab Spring and the Arab revolutions and protests, huge, drastic, dramatic shifts have taken place when it comes to the Islamists, whether Islamist movements and those who gain power and how they dealt with power. Because previously we had questions like, would Islamists accept democracy? Now, have things changed? After like a decade of the Arab Spring, do we have to rephrase the questions, to re-raise the questions, to redraft the questions, or to pose the questions in a different way? The issue, the discourse, the organizational structure, the political structure, the relationship with the others, many of us are enthusiastic and yearning to discuss the issue. And of course, it needs more than one session. Discuss thoroughly and more than one pillar and key issue in this regard. And also, we will have other pillars and topics and in many sessions to come. What about the Islamists in the opposition? What are their challenges? What are their situations after a decade? What about the Salafi movement? Islamists and women, which is a question of paramount importance. Also the external policies of the Islamic movement and other topics that are related to the field of studying the Islamic groups, the Islamist groups. And I'd like to welcome you all again, but particularly would like to welcome the authors of the 3 papers with their rich contribution. We'll start with Dr. Abdel Hakim Abu Louz from Morocco. In his paper that he talks about the experience of the justice and development part party in Morocco, as well as Dr. Ahmed Zaghroud Shalata, who addressed the Freedom and Justice Party prior to 2013 experience, and the prominent figure Salahuddin al-Georgian discussing al-Nahda's experience in power in Tunisia. So I'd like to welcome you all, and let us kick off the discussion initially with the three panelists, and allow me to start with Dr. Abdul Hakim Abu Rose, who has presented a very instrumental paper on the Justice and Development Party's experience in Morocco. Dr. Abdul Hakim, Dr. Abdul, yes. You're on mute. Yep. No, you're fine. You're fine. Doing fine now. So, Dr. Abdul Hakim, we raised the questions and probably listened to them, and we read your valuable paper that you submitted. And it was clear that the three papers have a critical attitude in reading the Islamist experience, and that's why critical thinking is of paramount importance in scientific research. So what are the key challenges that came across the path of the Justice and Development Party? Did its discourse change in Morocco during this period? Their experience in power, assuming power, did it add something valuable to their political practice? And probably another important question that goes beyond the mere Islamist movement to other actors in the scene. Can we say that political Islam's experience in power in Morocco has pushed forward multilateralism, pluralism, democracy, and from moving from a transitional phase the dedication of an established, robust democracy, or is it still faring its way in the landmine field, as they say? Thank you very much, Excellency Dr. Brahman. Due thanks to all those responsible for organizing this very important seminar. As a matter of fact, I can establish a connection between the challenges that the party, Justice and Development Party, has faced with the historical landmarks. First of all, in 1903, early 20th century, with the Mayo 16th bombings, 2003, sorry, not 1903, 2003 bombings in Casablanca. And their party decided to minimize its representatives in the local council by 50%, and without even giving a rational justification for its decision. The second landmark event is that when the party itself accepted the divisions, entertained the divisions in the government when it joined in 2011 the coalition and the government with the secular parties that were the extreme opposite to that party. And of course, the party was not able to absorb and acclimate to this issue unless it was able to introduce a change at the top leadership by dismissing the Prime Minister Abdullah bin Kiran from office. And the second earthquake, quote unquote, which is a drastic shift, is that whenever the party has introduced its Francophonie characterization and identity and out and regulating the cultivation of cannabis, because it has always said it is a kind of narcotics. So it lost in terms of those two issues. And also they accepted the first past the threshold in the electoral way of calculating the votes. So that's why the party has always accepted to offer such concessions and compromises that would have ramifications across the spectrum of the political scene, and also had to pay the price for it, even in terms of or its own internal structure, paying the price. So far, many challenges, be it in terms of action or political discourse. So in the future, there is hope that this party will be able to revamp and renew its political elite and probably engage in a self-criticism process that would really hold its figures accountable for their political experience and power, because this party is actually accepting to take serious blows only to reassume power, and accepts to pass on certain laws that it used to object. And the former Prime Minister Abdullah bin Kiran has always called for the fact that continuing with the party's compromises only to run the government would lead to the diminishing of the party itself. And he says there is no harm in leaving the government, rather than to keep accepting the heavy blows dealt at the party without actually conducting a serious assessment. And I forgot to say that the technical knockout is that the party accepted the normalization agreement with Israel, and the party actually passed it without even entertaining a certain review of its political discourse that was prevalent at the time. So the party actually should take the initiative to reintroduce a new political elite, offer these decisions as the newly options, or to engage in criticism and to hold its political leadership accountable. Otherwise, the ballot turnout will be serious in terms of the figures, because we have to conduct further research about the sociological this party to arrive at the decision. Well, Dr. Abdul Hakim, in your paper, you addressed a very important issue that you alluded to. You said it's part of criticism, but let me allow to reintroduce it in a different way, and probably Dr. Hiba could chime in after a while, especially given her book, The Islamists and the Political Option. You said that the party in Morocco lost its symbolic and started saying from its traditional ideological discourse, and this would lead to shrinking constituency and the space of support. Of course, it's up to many other parties, of the Islamic parties, also same with other parties, Tunisia. But is better because the
Recording in progress.
لما استلم الإسلاميون في مصر الاتفاقية السلام مع إسرائيل، بالتالي حركة التحول الحزب نحو حزب سياسي برامجي عملي، وخروجنا جميعا من نفق الفزاعة اللي دائما معروفة الحركية. ما رأيك بذلك؟
الحقيقة بأنه على مستوى المغرب دائما الفرقاء السياسيون عندما لا ينطلقون من الفراغ، بل الذاكرة السياسية فيها ذكريات غير حسنة. دائما يضربون المثال بالاتحاد الاشتراكي، ذلك الحزب اليساري الذي كان قويا، والذي عندما دخل المغرب في التوافق مع الراحل الحسن الثاني أعطاه سدة الحكم وعاد لينقلب إليه 4 سنوات بعد ذلك ليصبح الآن ليس قوة ولكن رقما عاديا جدا في الحياة السياسية المغربية، بالتعبير البلدي لا بيهش ولا بينش كما يقال. فالذين من داخل الحزب وخارجه لا يتمنون.
I mean that socialist party. So many people would not like to see a similar scenario with the Islamist parties, and they say certain parties paid a heavy price for becoming part of power and authorities. They lost their elites, they lost the grassroots and constituents, and they lost everything. And now they're begging at the doors of other political parties for certain positions here and there. So the Moroccan memory still remembers well such incidents, particularly that many people want to push the party in Morocco, the development party to that end, because in Morocco you have to share power with the monarchy, and in this case, this would increase the possibilities of the Justice and Development Party in Morocco could end up going that way, unless, God knows, unless two pivotal things happen. Is that probably if they end up going that road, it will be a chance for them to reintroduce and revamp their political elite with figures who were not blemished with the previous political propaganda or engage in self-criticism of the party and the entire mechanism. However, people say as it could lose its own capital, the party itself, because its main capital is the da'wah, the preaching about Islam, about religion. And therefore, it could end up becoming just another religious front. And by intuition, it could go back to religion and forget about politics. So the political memory in the parties are, and when they go back to from power, they might find themselves in the realm of oblivion, unfortunately, rather than becoming revamped into a newly renewed parties in terms of structures, of leaderships, and even at the grassroots level. Well, I have many questions, and for the interest of time, one last question for that matter, and I'm sure that the colleagues will be commenting a lot on this issue. My last question to you, Dr. Abdul Hakim, as a researcher in Islamic movements field and your colleagues in the area, what are the new questions that are being raised? In the past, yes, everyone raises different questions about the Islamic movements before they came to power. But now, the Justice and Development Party, of course, in Morocco, it's different from their Nahda counterpart in Tunisia. But they both got to power. So what are the research questions? What are the studies that are being called for or commissioned by researchers after a decade? What I raise a question does not pertain to Islamic movements, but rather I raise it for the entire Moroccan scene and setting, the context of the party itself. We're talking here we're not talking about a democratic atmosphere or setting par excellence in Morocco, but rather there is a hybrid democracy in Morocco. So I'm not really focusing or addressing the questions to the development and the Justice Party in Morocco, but rather it's about the overall democratic environment and respecting the available options in general for this development and Justice Party, where its rationalization of its decisions to entertain normalizations of relations with Israel or the Francophonic character of teaching or allowing for the plantation of cannabis, they always try to provide rational excuses to justify its options and decisions. However, you have to realize that we're functioning in a semi-authoritarian system. It's not full-blown democracy because just for the fact their advent to power and then leaving power is something extraordinary, not ordinary, of course. However, they have to take into consideration the weight of this setting, which is not a democracy, but rather a hybrid democracy. That's why the questions should not be addressed about this party. This would be doing them injustice. Yes, Islamic actors are important, but actually it will be addressed to the entire political regime, which is not a democratic political regime, but as characterized, classified by the studies, it's a hybrid democratic regime, and therefore it should pay the brunt of answering.
I will move to see Salah soon, but what we need is democratic struggle because we need further democracy. So we move from a hybrid system to a democratic system. And this is the responsibility of everybody. Mr. Salah ad-Din, good morning or good afternoon. Mr. Salah has a very balanced mentality, so we need to ask him very carefully selected questions. But I will ask you a general question, and it's up to you to answer. We look at the Tunisian experience with envy in the Arab world. We envy you in the Arab world for your experience in Tunisia. And we look at the Islamic movement, and in your paper, you mentioned some examples pro and against, with and against. They look at them as very much advanced to other Islamic movements, even in the level of democracy. Tunisia is way ahead of the Arab world in many indicators and has you have power sharing, political pluralism, higher freedoms. So what's different in the experience of Islamists? And we're talking about a Nahda movement or Renaissance party before and after the revolution, at the level of the challenges and at the level of the structure of the party. How do you read this? Thank you for your invitation. In my opinion, is that a Nahda movement was, surprised, pleasantly surprised, but later on, this pleasant surprise turned into a nightmare. It was surprised when it found itself moving all of a sudden and without being prepared from the opposition. They were a very vulnerable opposition before the revolution, and they moved all of a sudden from the protest and opposition to the power assumption. And this is a fact that needs to be very carefully considered because it will affect the approach of Al-Nahda in power. Because Al-Nahda moved to power without having a platform, without having a vision, without having an ideology to run the country. That's why it got involved in the trial and error approach. And a lot of people, a lot of Tunisians voted for them because they thought that a Nahda movement will be up to the expectation of the promises. They thought it will deliver on the promises it gave the people, and they thought that it will follow the sound ethical and moral behavior, and they will not commit the mistakes of the Democratic Party and even the Constitutional Party. And this transition put the movement in front of new challenges, different challenges. And we see it has a pragmatic tendency. So the movement tried to adapt to the new movement without losing its identity, its ideological Islam-based ideology or identity, and its ideological identity as a movement. They wanted to completely, move to a new status. So the movement has alliances and coalitions, and Al-Nahda started to look independently because the issue of the alliance or the coalition has a pragmatic tendency, and sometimes it's opportunistic politically, because the goal of Al-Nahda party was to stay in power, was to influence the policy and politics and to prevent themselves from leaving power. So when they started in the opposition, they coordinated with the Congress for the Republic, Mustafa al-Marzouqi, and Mustafa Biljafar, who established Democratic Forum Party or Atakatul Party or EDTL. So the party started looking for itself. When they found themselves in power and when they monopolized the prime ministry position, its relationship with its coalition, with its allies, led to opposite outcomes. So they have hegemony over the parties that cooperated with Al-Nahda. Al-Nahda found itself in front of the political elites in their different spectra because they got into conflict not with the extreme left or the left in Tunisia, but they got into conflict with the liberalists who supported Guy Sibsi, El-Baji Guy Sibsi, and they found themselves in conflict with the UJTT, with the trade unions, and with the media. And one of the parties, if you get, in conflict with the media has the capacity to attack you, to infiltrate you, to change the public opinion trends. So another party, once in power, they started to realize that they started losing grounds, and when they assumed power, they let out all devils from their caves, and they found themselves facing all this socio-economic and political and trade union spectrum, and they got in conflict with women, with different parties, different stakeholders. So moving to power made them, realize that they got into this trouble, into dilemma, rather than into an opportunity. When you talk to the symbols of An-Nahda movement, they talk as people who have influence on the current prime minister, but at the same time, you find them looking for real answers, serious answers, realistic answers to a community that lost a lot. The Tunisian community lost the middle class, lost its social and economic stability, lost its political stability, which is essential for the success of the democratic experience. This made even its allies, those who try to win over as allies from the West, whether in Europe or in the United States, wonder what is the capacity of another movement to lead the state? What is its platforms, its vision? So another movement is being questioned at the international and regional level. It's being questioned at the national and elite level, and it's being questioned within An-Nahda movement, because Al-Nahda in this experience lost many of its founding members who left the movement one after the other and made the current leadership feel that they are being neutralized, they are being reduced, and maybe in the future they will find themselves on the sidelines of the political life. So they are turning from a big body with a strong presence in the beginning of the revolution to a very small party with very limited impact. Mr. Salah, let me repeat a question I asked of Dr. Hakim and Abdel Hakim, and you are a researcher in the Tunisian affairs, in the Islamic affairs, and you know about the progressive Islamists and a former critique, but an objective one for the Islamic experience. Isn't this what we are seeking? I mean, an Islamic party that got involved in power and started, getting involved in political work and pragmatic work, even if they lost their experience and they went to the left, and after 4 years come back, we will be moving from one phase to another. So they will be developing their tools and papers. Isn't this a good thing, a healthy thing for democratic transition, or do you have a different opinion? The mistakes of political parties can be beneficial to the political parties, can be beneficial for the political experience in general. But to go beyond that, I believe that the Islamic movement experience in power, and Tunisia is an example of this, will expedite the potential that says the political Islam movements are going to be extinct soon. Their experience in power will put an end to their political existence and will involve many of their figures into other experiences away from political Islam principles. So I look at another party as going towards, it will disappear. after Al-Ghanouchi, and post Al-Ghanouchi, because Al-Ghanouchi represented the uniting force of many of the figures of the movement. But after the absence of Al-Ghanouchi, many important members will get involved into different experiences, and they might defect or might, we might witness some divisions in another movement, and we will witness a new phase where the Islamic political Islam will recede. Please allow me to interrupt you here, because I believe, Mr. Salah, you participated in a conference for FES 3 years ago, which was about post-Islamic, post-political Islam. And in the conference, we thought that this is the ordinary development, because those Islamic movements ended their role. The American researcher, when victory is not an option, he believed that the Islamic parties will be like the Christian parties in Europe, so they will start a new approach. Do you believe this will happen, or are we going in a different direction? I believe it's a deeper issue. Another party is leading the Islamic movement in Tunisia. I hope they would establish something similar to the Christian parties, the democratic Christian parties in Europe. In my opinion, now, if you take another party in the current situation, and if you put a mirror, and this mirror would tell us what is left of the logic and the approach of the Islamic system as we know it for the Muslim Brotherhood, you will find yourself in front of a very reduced stage. I mean, a lot of happened that made them really different from what they used to be. Now, another movement is vulnerable to all changes, is vulnerable to all approaches, because it's been subjected to self-criticism. In Tunisia, it's different from what we learned in the 1970s and 1980s. In Tunis, we have strong women who want to achieve gender equality. We have certain social classes, citizens who want economy that will achieve renaissance. Another party came to power without an economic vision at all. So it's like a good student for the international financial institutions. Morally speaking, they are facing a moral, crisis, because many young people distance themselves from another movement. So it's witnessing a very strong change now, and these 10 years might be considered one of the glories of Al-Nahda, but they can't rest on their laurels, and maybe the political mind of Al-Nahda cannot adapt or cannot expect that kind of challenges to come. This is beautiful, Mr. Salah. Ahmed Shalata, poor you. If these successful experiences faced all this criticism, and you're talking about Egypt before the military intervention in 2013, and your vision focused on the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood, but you raised a point that is really weird, which is the move from the reform-oriented to the revolution-oriented mentality for one wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. And talking about this, so I'm trying to speak slowly, interpreters. Somebody is asking us to slow down. I want to tell you something, Mr. Ahmed. Mr. Salah said in the Strategic Studies Center in 2011, and in that seminar, Mr. Salah said Islamists committed a mistake in confusing the transitional phase in transition to democracy to entrenching democracy, and the mistake in that transitional period was a sin, according to Salah al-Jorshi, Salah al-Din al-Jorshi. we don't want to evaluate the governance in Egypt. A lot of people talked about the mistakes of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood themselves have this insight as well. But what's beyond that? We're talking about Islamists who went outside governance. Can you get us involved into the debate between the Muslim Brotherhood figures? Do they have a horizon for the future? Political change, a lot of the movement is in Turkey, in Europe, a lot of them in prison in Egypt. What's the future horizon for this movement? Hello, Dr. Muhammad. Greetings, everybody. Greetings to all organizers. The governance experience, as you mentioned, the crisis of Muslim Brotherhood started by confusing the stage of getting involved in the transitional phase, and they depended on democratic tools from outside, but they were used for the direct interests of the organization, and they forgot about the transitional phase in the state. So they achieved some negative positions against them, which led to uniting all political forces against them until they were removed from power. The Muslim Brotherhood didn't think they will leave Egypt governance in such a short period, and this caused them a shock that made them deteriorate from their reform-oriented and mentality which they asked for before 2011. In addition to a number of political behaviors against them that fed the violence against the Muslim Brotherhood, which led to the deterioration of the reform-minded discourse and feeding the revolutionary discourse and the importance of violence, the importance of resistance to go back to power and to bring back the political track to its what's suitable to their project. So the revolutionary discourse was the optimal solution for several reasons. First, mobilization of the organization, because there was an internal crisis among the members of the party, because there was a contradiction between the reform mentality and exercising violence. So after their experience in governance, they started their discourse post 2013 using the revolution and violence, which I mentioned in this paper and in other articles. What's next? Do you think that the division in the Muslim Brotherhood is horizontal or vertical? These political divisions can result in more than the Muslim Brotherhood. Is there a trend going for revolution and revolutionary trend? And I believe that they are mainly the youth who are going for the revolution and the revolutionary mentality. Do you think there will be a paradigm shift, the ideological paradigm shift, or did the movement surrender to the fact that they have a lot of their figures in prison and they can't have a breakthrough in their ideological discourse?
Of course, divisions and secessions are both horizontal and vertical. Because there is always the pro-Sayyid Qutb discourse against the Banna reformist discourse, hegemonic for quite a long time. The pro-Qutb-like discourse was really important to mobilize the masses and also for the radicalized revolutionary attitude. And of course, there is a conflict and a contradictory attitude and positions because of different positions except by the leadership, especially those who were arrested. And there is a large number of its leaderships that actually are being put on trial, and they were even sentenced, and the Brotherhood actually literally ditched them, or so they think, or they and with the youth, especially after 2013, Many of their youth constituents are either in prison or abroad. Even those abroad, they had many life-related serious crises and conundrums that prompted them to give up on the brotherhood, as we've seen many of those living in Turkey or in Sudan. Because these are things related to crises in the daily life, social crises with the continuous situation and the poor situation, and there is no clear horizon for when the crisis will come to an end. And of course, this causes a cross-generational wrath or anger. Okay, so let me ask the panel researchers in this event, those who would like to take the floor, kindly raise your hand on Zoom, because there is hand feature in Zoom. If you want to take the floor to even to address other experiences. Dr. Heba literally raised their hand on camera rather than figuratively. Please. Actually, I really found it interesting to read Dr. Ahmed's paper. But my question, why did you decide to call it a revolutionary mindset or thought? It's a violence-based thought. Why revolutionary? It's violence because revolution is always connected with violence. And by the way, it wasn't their revolution. And when things came settled in 2011, they started to denounce the activism in the streets, even prior to the events of Muhammad Mahmoud and the clashes there, Muhammad Mahmoud area. So they are self-described as such, just like the regimes who self-proclaim that they are democratic, but they're not democratic. So they're not revolutionary, they're violent. The very last part in your talk, when you talked about the laying down the Sharia-based jurisprudence, justification and rationalization of the violence, and we need to be moderate within moderation, as quote unquote. You should trace back the thread back to its beginning. If you started with different strategic tactics that the Brotherhood politically used, this Sharia-based jurisprudence foundation is actually prompting me to raise more inquiries. When I used to teach my students at the American University in Cairo, what is Islam in the what is Islam and where is the political and where is the Islamic? Where is the political and Islamic movements and where is Islam in the Islamist political movements and vice versa? So if you go back to trace the origin, to start literally holding the thread or the line from the beginning, you can see that there is a Sharia-based backing or cushioning for political activism early on in 2011. They had something called the Sharia-based Commission for Rights and Reforms, which was actually established in tandem with the events in the revolution. With Sheikh Muhammad Abdul Maqsood, with Salafis, with Brotherhood. I never understood its membership and its formation, and it's a long story actually. And I sat with one of its members, and I failed to understand anything they were talking about. And of course, and it was not formal or informing Morsi when he came to power. And it has nothing to do with the Constituent Assembly when they are drafting the Constitution. There was a kind of asymmetry. There was always the Sharia-based, the religious, and then it disappears, and then the political appears on the surface, and vice versa. So, regardless of how much you accuse them that they failed, that they were too pragmatic and they failed people, but the way they manipulated this issue, is it authentic? We need to understand that. Is it authentic, original? Is there a credibility involved? And I'm not judging. I'm not accusing. I'm adopting a researcher's attitude. My political attitude is something else. But from research perspective, I'm not saying they are the super pragmatist or too much of a pragmatist, and they are not really the great leaders. But you can see that there is a kind of oscillation between ups and downs in the way they're using. And I know that one paper cannot encompass all details, but this idea of violence, because it's an idea of paramount importance, it's a long-lasting idea. Any organization, of course, there is always a covert, secret faction. And we've seen this historically in prior to 1952 revolution, political movements, they always have a faction or a wing that we know almost nothing about. So I just wanted to understand the dynamics. How does it take place? These groups and covert factions, how do they cope? And for the interest of time, how was the decision made inside the black box of the Brotherhood? I do claim that I was there present as a citizen, as a professor of politics, and as an actor with different parties from the far right to the far left, including the Salafis and the centrist Salafis. I never understood who takes the decision. It's easy for us to say, he's the lame excuse. Blame him. Morsi was just a puppet, he decides. But we have no clue. We have no proof. How was the decision made at the key moment? No one knows. I have a black hole in the constitutional declaration. The Minister of Justice, he said, I knew nothing. Advisors to the presidents, they said, we have no idea. The Brotherhood, they had an obscure. Morsi is not a legal expert. So who is the one behind doing the thing that caused the pandemonium and the chaos? So probably we need to zoom in on the scene. Probably the information and the tools are limited, and of course they have secrecy and classified the covert nature of their organizational structure and way of managing things inside the Brotherhood. They will still remain classified until someday might come and talk about them, as it happened. When they talked about what happened in the late 50s and early 60s. So we need to study more than one case and try to see decision-making mechanism. How was the decision taken? Probably this could help us understand more about their internal mechanism, because we're just outside, they're looking from the outside, and then we try to interpret. Thank you very much indeed for this paper. Thank you, Dr. Hipa, for your intervention. Dr. Malgrami, Professor of Sociology in Tunisia. She's a published author on Islamic movements and jihadi women. Dr. Amal, please. Good afternoon. Would like to welcome you all. And many thanks indeed for giving me this opportunity to be part of this very important conference. By the way, just a correction. I am a researcher and a student of Arab Islamic culture and thought. So I'm interested in Islamic thought, and in addition to that, I'm a specialist in the gender studies. One first remark kindly addressed about the title of the conference of ours, that using the quotation marks with regard to Arab Spring, particularly that we totally agree on this rubric, and nomenclature and language is an authoritarian institution and organization, and we're just projecting. And some Western entities are now also assessing the decade by using another metaphor, by saying the Arab winter. So in order to avoid, so kindly use the quotation marks to avoid any issues with the nomenclature, if you maintain the same title, of course. And also another observation or remark, the paper on Tunisia, the Tunisian experience by my friend Mr. Jourshi, and also the Egyptian paper, with regards to the verification and accuracy of the terminology. Mr. Jourshi and the other one used, Jourshi used a Nahda movement from the beginning to the end of the paper, which means that as if this movement is one consolidated unit, as a unified actor, consolidated actor. But we're talking about different actors in terms of age, in terms of performance. Of course, Samir Dilo's experience in governing cannot be compared to Rafiq Bouchlak's or Hamadi Jbali's experience in power. There is a divide across the generations, and the way they understood the requirements of the reality of the ground and the concept of political performance and the understanding of the legal mindset and the legal framework. And so probably say Nahda leaderships, and name them. Why not? To tell us this applies to the following key figures. But to talk about the movement as such, it's not a one concordant movement. There are disputes within, and there are positions adopted under the umbrella of the movement, Nahda movement, but they're issued by Rashid al-Ghannouchi, especially in the Western media, about his position against the same-sex issues and gays. So we can say that he adopts that, but then they officially declared it as if the Nahda movement is adopting it. With regard to the movements, especially their position on LGBT. So there are different actors, diverse actors. We need to be mindful of that. The second issue, particularly, we have to pinpoint the cross-generational divide, the difference among generations. Yes, in his oral intervention, Jarouchi talked about it, and in paper, I see no reference. The youth's perspective is of paramount importance. How do they see this, the dynamics of the movement? Or because if you talk to the Nahda youth, or those who were born last decade, the way they assess and approach these movements are totally different. Their ambitions are totally different. And of course, we've addressed, I talked to some of them, be it in Jordan or Tunisia or in Egypt. Of course, they are more influenced by globalized movements, activism, the revolutions. Sometimes they have wild ambitions that are not limited by the political performance, one like the ethics and the practice of politics. These Islamic experiences in power, to what extent did they maintain the ethical side of the story? And they were not, because we were not able to assess or appraise the ethical / moral system or scheme, which actually shrunk after they took power, and also the ethics of practicing politics in power. We have to consider that. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Amal. For the interest of time, we will be, of course, coming back to the esteemed panelists at the end of our discussion for today to address the comments. But now we go to Shafiq Shkair, then Dr. Khalil Lanan. Shafiq, Dr. Hisham after Khalil, because you raised hand literally. Our Egyptian colleagues insist on the actual literal on-screen raised hand. Shafiq? Well, let's start last. Thank you very much. I did say thank you, but I was on mute. Anyways, thank you very much for hosting me, and thank you all the panelists, and thank you for the authors. That really enriched us and enriched our information, and we do hope that it will benefit us more after the discussion. I'll start with the very last answer about the end of political Islam or the post-political Islam era. I discussed this issue in an indirect way in a paper of mine in which I addressed the soft ideology of the Islamic movement. The whole idea is based on the following: that every action of the core Islamic movements is based on two prongs. One, a certain jurisprudence legacy, divided or organized, regulated in a certain way, and the second prong on a certain segment in the Islamic world. There is a grassroots segment or constituency, and this segment of population could expand and could shrink. So what they call political Islam usually is the majority of the ummah, the nation, the constituency, irrespective of whether it is correct or incorrect, how they are approached. Jihadi movements, they also have a certain segment in the nation with their own historical views and attitudes and opinions. To date, there is no genuine approach and addressing of the issue. The real reservoir is in jurisprudence. It is the primary reason that should prompt us for reconsideration and revision robustly and courageously. Some might refrain from reviewing the jurisprudence in fear of stigmatizing the Islamic jurisprudence as extremist and violent, etc. And others don't want to revive it, because reviving it would actually contribute to the renaissance or the development of the Ummah, the Muslim nation. The political Islam as a movement shall not cease, will not end, because despotism has not ended, because despotism did not end. Coup d'etats did not end, because there is a stalemate in the Arab world, and we're always an echo or a reaction to the actions of others. The Islamic discourse in jurisprudence is defined as a series of exceptions. Since exception is contained, we will have pragmatism. And pragmatism is ever-changing and shifting with generations and with challenges, irrespective of whatever how we dub it or frame it. It's an exception to the norm. And so the Islamic discourse is not only there. There is the da'wah, the calling to religion discourse. It's a value of a series of values. Like the Shiites, they say the original primary governance and the subordinate secondary one. It's the original ruling and form of governance is to be honest. The exception or the secondary is when to lie. So for these moments, they want to assess how much they were true and honest, and how many times they were wrong, and how do they describe themselves. The other issue in the papers pertains to the way we decipher reality. There are challenges that they are forced to in power. We have to explain them, and we have to be really courageous to explain them. The challenges, whatever you call as the revolution and violence, or whatever, you name it, irrespective of the additions or the shades of meaning. These are exceptions vis-a-vis the coup, the toppling of the regime. And with the Brotherhood, yes, one faction, they were extreme in violence, and the others tried to theorize it and put a theoretical framework. And the third faction, they said the historical leadership of the Brotherhood. The three trends in the Brotherhood generally remain committed to their words. And that's why when you frame this event, you said, let's not talk about democracy, because the political Islamic movements, they adhere to democracy. Despite the fact they were practicing violence or the so-called revolutionary activism, they are still sticking to the fact that the state as a notion is legitimate. I'm not talking about the power and authority, the state. So we have here to invoke the context. There are missing parts, but there are known parts. The power, the authority has changed. This break, this discontinuation, this disconnect opens the doors for the advent of arms or violence, which are on the opposite extreme of democracy. And one last issue, the issue with the ballots. What does it mean, the legitimacy of the ballot box and all? There is a state, and there are regulating laws, and people have recognized, and they go to the ballot box and they vote, and they play the game by the rules. If we go to the United States, like Trump-Biden clash, yes, there are series of laws sometimes, but it is always under the umbrella of the state and the law. So we cannot say that this party is overcoming the others as overcoming or trying is against the rules of the game. No, one party should defeat the other. Apologies. I'm opting for this attitude. I have more criticisms dealt to the Islamists, but the papers actually prompt us or push us to go there. The Islamists, sometimes they repeat themselves. They repeat the stalemate. They had an opportunity during the democratic process, in the early stages of the democratic process, irrespective of the other reasons of failure that are extraneous, but there are also internal causes for their failure. The fact that they're shut off, or they decide to shut themselves off from the consciousness of the grassroots, from the streets, from the people, propaganda, and also insisting on acting as a da'wah-based movement. This is a good thing. And the final point in this case is that came to Doha in a forum by Al Jazeera back in 2015. Bin Kiran was in that forum. And of course, he distanced himself then between himself and the revolutions. But he said one of the good things in Morocco, which is a proof to the fact that the Islamic movement has advanced. He said the rainfall is one indication that we're doing is correct. we were this demagogy is an issue. We often see it in the discourse, and as of course, for the interest of time, the papers are very useful, and hope we'll have a better opportunity later on with the colleagues for a more extensive dialogue.
We want to seek the input from Dr. Khalil Al-Anani. I'm driving now. I will come back to you soon. Okay, we'll come back to you soon. Hisham Jafar. Dr. Hisham, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you clear and loud. Sometimes, in prison, you speak about redefinition. I was among Muslim or Islamic parties about reproduction of the Islamic approach in politics based on what happened in the Arab Spring. And I would like to mention what Dr. Muhammad Abu Rahman said about the main issue that we want to bring back to its right track. The end of the Islamic exclusions in politics. And this is very important because this is a political reaction. And I believe that the most important lesson that we have learned in the last decade, and I insist on the word Arab Spring without quotation signs or marks, to recognize the Islamic movements or political Islam. Because the most important thing in what happened on the 30th of June in Egypt is that the Ikhwan was looked at as a political movement. And this is what Georgi and Abu Loz talked about. They concluded that elections change, they lose votes gradually. And in other elections, they might win some votes. So this is important. And maybe in the future, and this is a question that we need to look at carefully because it will create other approaches. Are we going to study the Islamic movements as Islamic movements or as political actors, just like other political actors? So we talk about the political party, its weaknesses, its strengths, its constituents, and constituency. So a keyword mentioned by Gorshi in his paper, and it's related to the paper's title, that eventually what has been achieved by a Nahda party did not meet the expectations of the grassroots from a certain political actor. And this is a keyword. And it was mentioned by Dr. Abuloz and it was mentioned by Ahmed Shalata. So eventually there has been some expectation. There have been some expectations related to the Arab Spring, but it has not, or they have not been met or achieved. So the main 2 points related to this is the social contract, the new social contract. The Arab Spring and the Arab Spring narrative is a narrative that is based on the social contract. So we need to rethink wealth and power locally, regionally, and internationally. This is the foundation of the Arab Spring, regardless whether we had activism in Morocco, but it had not turned into a full-fledged revolution. But the last decade presents the issues in this framework. So we go back to the narrative of the Islamic political movements or political Islam, which they used to enter from the 20th century to the 21st century. And if I want to talk about the main problems in the 3 papers, there is a number of problems that have been represented in different ways, except for Ahmed, who talked about the reform and revolution-minded approach. So the 3 papers talk about the problem between the relationship between the da'wah and political orientation. between the development platform and the development approaches, and they talked about the organizational structures, and Mr. Ahmed talked about the organizational and its relationship. Can it be a replacement of the state authority? Another problem that was mentioned in the papers is the Islamization of the community, because this is part of the narrative that the Islamists brought from the 20th to the 21st century. The Islamization of the community. Do we need to have among us to, keep the people to interpret the holy books as they wish? Now, with the Arab Spring, we have a new narrative, a new discourse, different from the previous ones. The problems lie in the fact that the Islamic movements are still controlled or dominated by the key narrative that is linked to the 20th century and moved to the 21st century, which highlighted the main contradictions that we see on the ground. In my opinion, this might be in the transitional period, because they can't create a new narrative that can be called the Arab Spring narrative that involves a new, social contract. And maybe, as you mentioned, that we are post-political Islam, and we might also reproduce Islamism in the political arena in different formats and new paradigm shifts, because this is what we can call Islamic alternatives. Since alternative Islamists are available in the social and cultural spaces, the Arab Spring tells us that the transition from the social arena and cultural arena to the political arena is possible if there is a balance of power. And the question, which is mentioned in one of the papers in the main paper of this conference, the relationship between political Islam by entrenching the democratic process and the redistribution of wealth, because this is of paramount importance, in my opinion, for the Arab citizens. Thank you very much. Dr. Khalil, are you ready or not yet? Dr. Khalil, are you there? Yes? Go ahead, please. Muhammad, I asked you to keep me for last. You're the last one. You're the last one. Stop, stop your car and speak to us. Okay. I pulled over, and thank you very much. I have a couple of points, if you allow me, very quickly. I will start from the theme of the conference, the assessment of Islamists in power. I would like to, highlight this issue. As Shafiq mentioned, we need to, analyze things in the context, in the dynamics that happen in a way or another. So we need to discuss political Islam post-Arab Spring. Are we in the process of transition for the structure of power from one actor to another? The three experiences we have, the Egyptian, Tunisian, and Moroccan experiences or cases, it's difficult for me to realize that there is a power sharing or transition of power fully. And this is important in the analysis, because the assessment of any governance experience, especially for opposition who made a sudden transition, we need to consider the other stakeholders, the other actors in power who had a strong influence on power. In Morocco, for example, it's difficult for me to assess and evaluate realistically the performance of Islamists in power without talking about the state, and the state or the government that allowed independence work. We found that the state is still in control, like it used to be in previous contracts. So what has been given to Islamists wasn't enough power that gives us, or enables us to assess their experience. It's difficult to say that Justice and Development Party were, free to move freely, which allows me as a researcher to assess their experience. Of course, I can assess their parliamentary, legislative, and policy performance, but they were governed by a balance of powers that they cannot control. Who would realize, who would, Saad Din Uthman, who wrote an article in 1990s, who considered normalization with Zionists as one great sin, would be the one who signs in the Moroccan foreign ministry, who signs the normalization agreement. So I'm trying to understand, but not to justify what they did. I'm trying to, highlight the issue. And I'm not concerned about success or failure. I want to understand why. So the why is what matters to me. In Egypt, despite their short experience in power, I can't assess their experience as a researcher, but in Egypt, I can't assess whether it's Muslim Brotherhood or not. Even if there was a party that came to power in Egypt under military control, we cannot assess their experience. Were the Muslim Brotherhood in power? Indeed, this is a question we need to realize. It's difficult for us to say. There was a lot of competition from old regime, from old powers, from the old guard, and this is very important in the Egyptian case in particular. So the idea of assessment would be lagging because it doesn't give us the full image of what we're trying to understand, or it makes us, hold our horses a bit. There's a big essay in English about the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood, but I did not look at them from the political perspective or from the ethical assessment. But I want to talk about the balance of power within the Muslim Brotherhood organization. Who controls what? Who controls who? And this is what Hiba Raouf said. We want to understand the decision-making dynamics. Who controls and who decides what, under what benchmarks, under what criteria. And this is the in-depth analysis of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we are puzzled, when we try to identify the strengths in the Muslim Brotherhood. Who controls what? Who makes what decision? What balance of power controls the Muslim Brotherhood? So it's very easy for us to describe, but it is difficult to justify why the decision was made to run for office in 2012. What are the internal balance of power? What is their internal mobilization? Why they made this decision now? Although they said we will not run for president. So why did they run for presidential elections? So I see, based on the Muslim Brotherhood, I see that there is lack of accuracy. We might oversimplify that it's a battle between non-violence and violence, or revolution and reform mentality. We are going into authoritarian and internal conflict inside the organization, because every current claims they rejected violence. That's why they are accused or stigmatized, or they are stigmatized because of their revolutionary mentality. I want to understand the dynamics of the transition, because it's not fair to get into this trap. We don't have enough information about them so far, and this is the systematic approach of the three papers. Any analysis of Islamists should not stop by the desk research, we need field studies, we need surveys, we need participatory observations, we need to coexist with them, we need to interview them and learn how they make decisions at certain times. So it's more complicated than what people think inside the Muslim Brotherhood. They wanted to take a different approach from the traditional approach of the Muslim Brotherhood. And this takes me to the mediators dimension. We always focus on the formal structure of the organizations, the role of the leadership, the ideological discourse, and this is very important. But what we're talking about, the fluidity of the movements. We should not, interpret what's happening, but I need to understand what they're doing as researchers. What does this mean on the ground? When I worked on Muslim Brotherhood post the coup d'etat, I found that major part of their position in Egypt was personal experience, personal trauma. There is personal trauma, personal grievances, anger, emotions, and this is part of the context. Part is related to the fall of the big dreams on the rock of reality, and part of it is related to the trust that was broken all of a sudden. So there are a lot of personal issues that explain to us why a certain current divides a certain group, and it's difficult to, restrict this to some decisions made by this leader or that leader. So we need to go deeper, to dive deeper, to learn what happened. Dr. Muhammad, you asked a question about how is the situation or the status quo of Muslim Brotherhood now. It's very difficult to answer from the research perspective, from political perspective, and from methodological perspective, because you're not talking about one consistent, coherent block as used to be in the last 80 or 90 years. We don't have clear lines of leaders, of leadership. We don't have the organizational structure, consistent organizational structure. The group is in soul search, and they were in recovery in the ICU. And this group will never be again like it used to be in the past for many reasons. What's new is that the narrative of the plight will yield no fruits, because what the youth, the youth of the Muslim Brotherhood saw revolution, coup, massacres, and they saw problems within the group. So I don't think that the grassroots of the Muslim Brotherhood are similar to pre-2013. We're talking about a different universe. We're talking about a different situation, be it from those who left the group, those who left religion even, and they converted to other religions. There is complete rejection of politics, and there is some revolutionizing of what's happening. It's not violence, but they try to go to revolution. So it's difficult for me to accept that Muslim Brotherhood or part of them move to violence consciously or on purpose. It's difficult for me to be processed in my mind, because the issue of violence in political notion, we're not talking about jurisprudence. You are under political security pressure and under persecution that is unprecedented, so you need to defend yourself. So there is political injustice. Yes, after the revolution, they had a group of scholars who, try to justify violence. But you're talking about tens of thousands of active members. So even if we take it from different benchmarks, we need to, break it down to smaller parts. It's not like polar speech or Hassan al-Banna speech. It's beyond this. It's more than this. Thus, we don't have a lot of information about what's going on in the Muslim Brotherhood now. There are 2 studies I conducted about Muslim Brotherhood in prison and the impact of prison, and I interviewed people inside the prison. some of them were previous prisoners or ex-prisoners, and they were released, and Muslim Brotherhood in the exile. So I met both. I learned about their personal injustice, about their vision for the universe, their vision for themselves, and for the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's very difficult. It's very difficult for me to write a paper. I have been unable to write a paper for 3 years because this requires us a methodological, a systematic approach. We need a methodological revolution different from what we used to follow in terms of the study research before the Arab Spring and before the coup in Egypt.
Sorry to stop you, but for the interest of time, I should also stop because the kids are calling me and I need to start moving the car. Okay, we'll go backward now. By Shalata, Sisalah. Well, I do concur with many of the remarks. We're not here about assessing or appraising an experience, but rather we're trying to analyze some of the practices in light of the information accessible by the research. The Brotherhood itself, many people do not know the decision-making mechanism, whether during the days they were in power or afterwards. Lack of information, the power play, the power balance, and it's also the power balance between the Murshids or the Supreme Guide office and the rest is not known. There is an organizational / institutional aspect where some of the leaders were employed to justify, rationalize, and they even also try to rationalize it while falling back on religion and jurisprudence just to alleviate the pressure on some of their young constituents, given the enormous crushing pressure on the Brotherhood itself, particularly with the young generation, who were pushed to the front of the clashes, unfortunately, directly, and they were brutally repressed by the ruling authorities in the country and also in the diaspora. So there is no single indicator that we can judge the idea of violence in their behavior in this regard. More than indicator. And always there is this question, is it the thought first, the ideology first, or is it the movement second, or the brotherhood? Or is it vice versa? Because in many previous attitudes, it's the personal view of the leader, and then they enframe it. They force a jurisprudence, Sharia-based religious framework on it to justify it. The Brotherhood, during the last decade, through their practices, they proved that they're undergoing many intellectual and political and organizational crises within. In 2013, we've seen that some Salafi groups have been used in order to go against the more organized Salafi faction, which is a Noor party in Secondary. So the Sharia-based commission tried to justify that this is an intra-Salafi problem and that the Brotherhood is a higher, more supreme organization. Just last point for the interest of time. Yes, there are many crises, intellectual, political crises, direct and indirect factors, and there is always the personal factor, which is actually the prime driver of many decisions by the Brotherhood for the time being. Salah, thank you. Because the question you raised needs to be expanded on more. And the very simple study I suggested could soon turn into a book, because the scene with the Nahda movement in Tunisia is very much complicated. Yes, there are multiple actors inside the movement, but at the end of the day, Rashid al-Badnouchi tried to rein in that pluralism, which is also a reality. He's trying to curtail it, to limit it, and to push it towards a certain direction to reach a certain decision or a certain policy. And this policy changing, although the general guidelines and the underlying key lines are to be maintained. So Ghanouchi's role continues to be central. But those who are against him disagree with him on the way he's running the movement or the way he deals with political events, and the opposition is increasing day after another against Ghanouchi. Now you can tell that within the movement there are 5 clear general trends or lines that could soon become either 5 parties or 5 movements or whatever, or 5 factions. Yes, there are conflicts within, and probably a most important indicator that Nahda might soon lose its position as a key power are the youth, the young generation that are now starting to become mature and to distance itself from the leadership and the organization and deal very serious criticism against them. They opted out, and now they're in between. We don't know which way they will go. So the divide across the generation is really important within the movement. It's not a very simple political formula that Nahda found itself cornered with. The last remark is that the problem with the Nahda movement now is that its existence in power is it's in power for the power's sake, for the existence. So now it is now attached to the mentality that they need to stay in power. And I do recall personally, I asked Ghanouchi, I asked them, why do you want to stay in power? Although every day you keep paying a heavy price for staying in power, and you're burning all your assets and cards and your popularity among the people, because of crisis you're not always responsible for. But his answer was very difficult for me, although I've been following on it, the details of the movement. He says if we distance ourselves from power, they will throw us back in jail, we'll be hunted and persecuted again. But inputs have changed. The situation is saying no single party now can push you into exile or send you to prison. So if they are seeking power, protect themselves against uncertain threats and risks, this is a political intellectual plight and conundrum for the party, i.e. the movement. So the Nahda movement is now vis-a-vis a very central choice and issue. They have to leave power, reconstruct itself, rearrange and reshuffle its own cards, and to think for a new political ideology and thought, because now it has expired. I mean, its thought has been used up and utilized, and therefore they need very thorough and drastic reviews. Thank you very much. Dr. Abdul Hakim. Just wanted to say what Benkeran means about the rainfall. The social, political, and economic performance of the government in Morocco is always pending the rainfall. If we have a good rainfall that year, the economic performance is good. I guess this is what he alludes that. If it rains, the government will have a better economic performance, which will be positively reflected on its opinion polls. But in order to distance ourselves from the formal discourse of the Islamists, I believe the challenges before the Islamic movement now is that they have to go back to their social constituency and base. The Islamic movement attracts its supporters from the middle class. That's why probably this would help them go in one direction to seek new potentials. As for the other issues with the Dawah based and to call for religion by intuition and by nature, this is an issue in Morocco because the call for religion and Dawah is an exclusive right to the king because he is the prince or leader of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'mineen. And no one can do that on his behalf. But of course, there are many challenges that could prevent the party from renewing itself and rejuvenating itself as a party. And that's why they need to reconsider the overall collective coherence and structure and to look for fresh political figures that would suffice for fighting the future political battles. Thank you very much, Dr. Hakim. Thank you all indeed. And of course, I cannot, of course, can never agree more with the value of the input here, and I hated to interrupt some of you, but I don't want to reach a conclusion that had the Islamists stay in opposition it would have been better for them. I wouldn't say that. But let's talk in our next session, next time, about the experience of the Islamists in the opposition, what are their priorities, their transformations. Thank you very much indeed. And of course, once we decide on the next session, of course, one of the colleagues will be moderating it, and we will be agreeing on the date and time and the panelists. And also, thank you, Mr. Yusuf from behind the scenes from Federation Shifum, and also my colleague Ahmed Miqdad from PSI, and the rest of the team at Frederick Shebert and PSI, of course. Thank you all for your time, for your ideas, and I do hope that we'll remain in touch. Thank you very much. See you soon. Thanks a lot.
Recording stop.